Thank you very much. Just this morning I was told that I better speak English. I wanted to speak in Russian for the introductory part of my statement for the benefit of the Russian media. But I understand that the Russian media is not very popular in Europe this day. So I will stick to English. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me once again, which means that we still have something to discuss. It's encouraging. I believe that the Mediterranean dialogue, the meetings in this format are very much in demand. The Mediterranean, which is a cradle of world civilizations and world religions, is now a huge hotbed of international tension, the source of very, very dangerous challenges, including terrorism, drug trafficking, illegal migration, other forms of organized crime. And certainly we are very, very much concerned by very fast basically very fast process of Christian presence being reduced drastically. And this is happening in the countries where from times immemorial the representatives of various confessions lived together in peace. And this, of course, is a direct result of the attempts to impose upon the peoples of the Middle East and North Africa the values which are foreign to them, the values and the recipes of how they should live in their own countries. Not only these countries, but the entire international community is paying a very high price for such reckless politics, including the countries who, having violated the international law, the principles of the United Nations Charter, provoked chaos and anarchy on this huge geopolitical space. And sometimes it is my impression that the lessons of Iraq, Libya, Syria are not really taken into account by those who try to continue those arrogant policies in this region. We know how the world order, the international law, the fundamental international agreements are being ruined. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran is one example. The treaty on the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, is under threat. The principles of open trade of WTO are also under attack, and quite aggressive attack. And in general, I have spoken about this today with my Italian colleague, there is a trend to substitute international law as we have known it, as we still know it, I hope, by something which our Western diplomatic creative friends call rules-based order. I really don't understand why international law as a principle, which has been with us many, many decades and centuries, is now not a popular principle to guide us in international relations. And the attempts are very clearly made in the context of this logic of rules-based order to privatize multilateral global institutions, institutions of global management. And the case in point is what is happening in Organization on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, where our Western colleagues are pushing through an approach which, in direct violation of the Convention on Chemical Weapons, attempts to give the technical secretariat, it is called technical secretariat, the functions to attribute guilt. The Convention provides only for this organization to establish whether a chemical substance, a prohibited chemical substance, has been used or not. If you want to give this convention additional functions, there is a way provided for in the convention itself. Propose amendments, negotiate amendments, adopt amendments, ratify amendments. Yes, it takes a bit longer, but sometimes easy does it. And the international life cannot be geared to the ideas and policies of those who live only through the prism of their domestic electoral cycles. By the way, the similar attempts are being made in relation to the Convention on Prohibition of Biological Weapons. In the UN Secretariat, some people would like to create a mechanism which would be deciding who violated the convention and who is not. I want to remind you in this regard that for about 15 years, actually soon after the convention soon after the convention entered into force, we were among those who actively proposed to establish a verification mechanism under the convention itself. This was categorically rejected by basically the United States. I don't even remember what administration was there in the White House. It was about 20 years ago, and this is unfortunately the situation now. So instead of going through the way of international law and to negotiate a verification mechanism in the context of the convention itself, people want to authorize some group of experts appointed, I don't know by whom, in the UN Secretariat to do this job. And of course, another example of the attempts to substitute international law with rules-based order is what we witness in the Council of Europe, where a small but very aggressive group of parliamentarians is directly undermining the statute of this unique pan-European organization, especially the principle of the statute which guarantees equal rights for all member states in all organs of the Council of Europe. And maybe we were not listening too well 4 years ago, even more than 4 years ago, in March 2014, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was at that time Secretary General of NATO, he stated that the unified will of the members of NATO is extremely powerful source of international political legitimacy. So this was, I believe, one of the first hints that people would like to forget about international law, as we have known it for centuries and millennia, and introduce some rules which would be based on the exceptional political legitimacy of groups like NATO. I think that comments are not necessary on this one. Now, by the way, Anders Fogh Rasmussen is functioning as counsel or advisor to President of Ukraine, and I don't believe that his advice is really going to be helpful to resolve this crisis on the basis of Minsk agreements and Security Council resolution which endorsed the Minsk agreements. Then there is another one in line with this issue between international law and rules-based order. Our French colleagues recently announced an initiative which they call European Initiative on Intervention, which was explained as being something they want to develop inside the European Union and NATO, or rather, I'm sorry, outside the European Union and NATO, because EU and NATO in French understanding are too cumbersome in adopting decisions. So we are still asking our French colleagues what do they mean actually, and how this initiative, European intervention initiative, how it relates to the international law, whether we can see the situation when one more instrument of surgical intervention would be invented for the African continent, because African crisis and African peacekeeping was mentioned as something which require much more robust approach. But the term intervention itself is rather telling. And I was just wondering if some other country, maybe outside EU and NATO, would announce an initiative using the word intervention, how NATO and the EU would react. I believe you don't need to dwell upon this for too long. International information security is something which the United Nations has been discussing for about 10 years. trying to develop universally applicable and universally accepted rules of responsible behavior in cyberspace. Yes, it's a long process, but conventions cannot be negotiated easily, and the international rule, universal rules, cannot be negotiated easily. But instead of concentrating on this work inside the United Nations, there are new, very dubious initiatives which allow for violation of state sovereignty and which dilute the role of state in ensuring cybersecurity in general. I would also mention the attempts to regulate the media. There are not only proposals but already legislation introduced in some European countries to declare that certain media could be included on the white list, and certain media should not be allowed to inform the public about their views on one or another event. I don't believe it is very democratic, frankly, and don't believe this is in line with the principle which has been proclaimed in early 1990s by OSCE, which demands that the media and the public must have unlimited access to information. That was international law, of course. The ideas to blacklist and whitelist media outlets is a rule on which they want to base new order. So we are close to a situation when we have to really say very firm no to the attempts to revise and fragment international law. The realities of the 21st century demand to come back to the basics, to the United Nations Charter without any dubious interpretations, and they demand us to come back to the restoration of the central role of the United Nations as the only universal organ of managing international relations, with the Security Council being the organ responsible for international peace and security. We have to get rid of the inertia and of the initiative which are rooted in the 19th century colonial and imperialist philosophy. Because otherwise it would be impossible to try to resolve the crisis and conflicts in the Mediterranean region. Only on the basis of international law we can resolve the situation in Syria, where the resolution of the Security Council 2254 is the very solid foundation, and in a nutshell it demands that everything must be done by the Syrians themselves on the basis of mutual consent between the government and the opposition. And it is with full respect of this principle of mutual consent among the Syrians that Russia, Turkey and Iran initiated Astana process, which evolved into the Sochi Congress of the Syrian Dialogue, and which decided to create constitutional committee, the formation of which is now being finalized. It's also only on the basis of international law that we can resolve the crisis in Libya, which was ruined by NATO bombings in gross violation of the Security Council resolution. As you remember, the resolution only spoke about declaring no-fly zone, meaning that the aviation, the air force of Gaddafi cannot fly, and they were not flying. But instead of ensuring the no-fly zone, NATO bombed the Gaddafi troops and helped the people with very bad reputation, armed by some Europeans in violation of the Security Council embargo, and also by some regionals, to help these people to topple the government of Gaddafi, and then to start creating trouble throughout Africa. The same very people who toppled Gaddafi with the weapons of you know whom, they later was threatening the same government in Mali when they moved down south and created a huge risk to Bamako. So for Libya, it is also absolutely clear that this Herat principle, that the Libyans themselves must resolve the crisis and that all of them must be part of inclusive dialogue, is absolutely indispensable. It is on this basis that Russia participated in the conference in Palermo, where the head of Russian government was a chief delegate from my country. And of course, to ensure stability in this Mediterranean region, including Libya, including Syria, including Iraq, and other countries who influence the Mediterranean region, would be impossible without the solution to the oldest regional problem, I mean the Palestinian problem. And it must be solved on the basis of the United Nations resolutions and on the basis of the Arab Peace Initiative. But here as well, the international law embodied in these resolutions is being substituted by some rules which are not universally accepted and which would only make the situation even worse if I understand anything in how the Palestinian issue is evolving. Russia would continue to support the efforts, including the efforts of Egypt, to help Palestinian reconciliation between Ramallah and Gaza, and we would certainly be supportive of the need to restore the direct dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis, and we reaffirm our proposal made a couple of years ago to host a meeting between the leaders of Palestine and Israel in Russia without any preconditions. Of course, we cannot ignore the situation on the other side of the Mediterranean. I mean the Balkans. The countries of the region are being pulled into NATO without trying to ask the people whether they want this or not. The referendum as a means of direct democratic statements by the people are not really popular. At the same time, the opinion, the public opinion in those countries is really being aggressively pressured, and the number of Western leaders who campaigned in Macedonia during that referendum is really amazing. The heads of government, the ministers, Secretary General of NATO, High Representative of the European Union were directly arguing in favor of something which is challenged inside Macedonia. And there were no fuss about the direct interference in the domestic matters of this country. Anyway, I am getting close to the end of my introductory remarks. We believe that all these problems can only be resolved collectively. And we should not forget about a very useful contribution which OSCE might make in this sense. We are satisfied, and I state with pleasure, that the Italian chairmanship in office of OSCE is paying increased attention to the entire complex of the issues related to the region. And the Italian chairmanship suggested to consider in the forthcoming ministerial meeting in Milan a declaration on Mediterranean dimension of OSCE, and we support this initiative. We want the Mediterranean to get back its historic role of the bridge between civilizations, and we want to help ensure peaceful development and prosperity of this region. I believe if we act together and if we don't have any hidden agendas, if we don't apply double standards, we can do this.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergei Viktorovich, for this introduction, this all-encompassing introduction. And I would take the privilege of moderating this podium by asking a couple of questions, and then I would give the floor to some questions, to some other questions. Now, you mentioned Libya. The recent conference in Palermo marked the progress in the efforts to stabilize the country. My question to you is what Russia can and is ready to do to help to stabilize the situation. What role do you want to play in the future of Libya? And are you considering a military presence like in Syria?
On the last one, of course, you should make a difference. In Syria, we are there on the basis of the request from legitimate government, member of the United Nations, unlike some other participants of the situation in Syria. On what we can do for the Libyan settlement, we are not claiming that we want or can play a leading role. It's for the Libyans themselves to agree on how they want to get out of this mess. From the very beginning of this crisis, though, we have been talking to all Libyan figures, both in Tripoli, in Tobruk, and elsewhere. And this was not actually what some other external actors were doing. Some of them were putting their support on one Libyan group, some on the other group. We thought this was not right. And we have been, just like in Syria, by the way, we are talking to everybody in Syria, except ISIL, of course. And just like in Yemen, we talk to everybody. And I am gratified that these days the approach by other important outside players is the same one as we believe should be applied, namely that people understand the need to have an inclusive dialogue on Libya among the Libyans themselves. The efforts by France in May was a step in the same direction, and now Palermo conference made another step, bringing together the key figures. So I think this is the only way, and I already mentioned that I don't believe in any artificial deadlines, be it on Libya, be it on Syria. Nobody says let's have a deadline on the Palestinian issue, right? But somehow on Libya people might try to set a deadline. On Syria, our good friend Staffan de Mistura is being pressured to announce a deadline and to say this is it. Why? The substance is much more important than artificial deadlines. So we're not pretending to know everything about Libya. We're not pretending to play a key role. We support the efforts of the neighbor states, Egypt, Algeria. We believe that they should be encouraged. And of course the United Nations, the Special Envoy Salame has the ideas which I believe go in the right direction. They certainly require fine-tuning on the basis of the specific attitude of various Libyan players, and certainly the Arab League could be very much important in helping to resolve this crisis, just like the Syrian crisis for that matter. I believe it was a mistake of the Arab League to expel Syria from its ranks, and now I sense the understanding among the Arabs that Syria must be brought back to the Arab family.
But I see your point of not putting or setting artificial deadlines. But on the other side, if you don't set the deadlines, the crisis can go endlessly. I mean, like in Syria, I think the last deadline for which Staffan de Mistura insisted was the Constitutional Committee, if I'm not wrong. If you don't have this Constitutional Committee, how can you go out of the crisis? So there must be a way of putting a kind of pressure on the actors, namely on the Syrian government.
Gently, putting pressure gently. And Staffan is a facilitator. The resolution clearly says that there must be Syrian-owned, Syrian-led process. Until the Sochi Congress in January this year, nobody was talking about any deadlines. The Geneva process was non-existent for 10 months. Before, in December 2016, Russia, Turkey, and Iran initiated the Astana process. And the process was for the first time organized the way which provided for the government and the armed opposition to sit down at the same table. When I discussed this thing with my Saudi colleague, he said this is an absolutely right approach because it is much more important and productive to talk directly to the people who fight you on the ground. This is not to say that we don't recognize the need to work also with immigrants who left Syria, who live in foreign capitals, but they cannot be the only representative of the negotiators with the government, as they tried to perceive themselves and to present themselves. So what Astana format did was the first actual step to wake up the United Nations process, which was very dormant, as I said, and to initiate direct dialogue between the government and the broadly represented opposition. Then we managed to convene the Sochi Congress on the national dialogue, the Syrian National Dialogue, which decided to create a constitutional committee. Before that, nobody was lifting a finger, including those who are now saying, well, where is the constitutional committee? It must be efficient tomorrow. It takes time. It's much more important to have a functional and mutually acceptable constitutional committee than to have an artificial deadline in order to ruin the Astana process. Those who insist on Stefan setting a deadline and saying, this is it, this is my list, I don't care what you think, they want only one thing, to ruin Astana process and to come back to some regime change logic. By the way, when the ISIL was close to the outskirts of Damascus in August 2015, nobody was calling on the opposition to start negotiations with the government. But after the situation changed on the ground, now everybody is calling on the government to start negotiations. Bias in this kind of issues is absolutely counterproductive. And such approaches demonstrate not only the double standards, but they reveal that people who promote such approaches think about their own geopolitical games, not about the fate of the people who are in need to be helped to get out of the crisis.
Thank you. I would give the floor to a couple of questions. And of course, I strongly recommend short questions. And of course, the minister will be concise. Please.
How do you know?
So, Youssef Sharif from Tunisia. Mr. Lavrov, whenever I hear you or when I hear Russian decision makers, there is always the stress on the need to support the states in the region and that the state is the primordial thing. But my question is, what's the rationale of having states if they kill and torture and imprison thousands of their own populations? What's the rationale of keeping these kind of states? And this goes to my second quick question.
No, that was about which country?
In the region in general, Syria, or I mean, the policy of supporting the state instead of supporting populations or civil society and so on. And now that you're one of the most respected countries in the region, can you ask your friends in the region to be slightly less violent to their own population? Thank you.
What was that? It's very bad acoustic. Who should be a bit less violent?
Well, the countries like Syria and the regimes in the region in general.
Supporting the state versus supporting the population.
And then the states to be less violent on the population.
Yeah, the states must not be violent against the population. This is the obligation under the many international legal instruments. And I hope these legal instruments would not be substituted by those who want to forget about international law and to introduce rules-based order, not really understanding that others do not believe in the rules imposed upon them. There were attempts in the past, not once, to impose your own rule. There was even the term new order, and we know what was the outcome of these efforts. On authoritarian regimes being governments of the states members of the United Nations vis-a-vis the citizens of their own countries. I already said what is the principle which we apply. There are international obligations on human rights, and you cannot use your sovereignty, to avoid your commitments on respect of human rights and freedoms. On the other hand, we have to be realistic, and we have to take the picture in its entirety. If you are obsessed with human rights and don't give a damn about the stability of countries, if you don't give a damn about the right to life, which is a human right, by the way, not to mention economic and social rights, then I'm afraid you are one-sided. Yes, Iraq, Libya, Iraq, modern Libya, were considered, rightly so, authoritarian regimes. But the right to life risks and violations were maybe hundreds of thousands less than after the people's revolutions happened, both in Iraq and Libya, with foreign intervention. Ask the Libyans how they used to live. Ask about the educational rights. Ask about the economic situation which they enjoyed. They will tell you. So you cannot say, forget about anything, bring freedom to the people. And you cannot say, forget about human rights and be respectful to any government which is sitting in the capital of a country.
So you were concise, indeed. Please, I see there in the center, right.
Mr. Minister, Saudi Arabia, but particularly Mohammed bin Salman, has been in the news in recent times, but not for the good reasons. And now, like as a Russia, would you support an international investigation to find out exactly what had happened to the murder of the Jamal Khashoggi? Not what had happened, but who ordered it, because the convention right now, the major argument and the initial results suggest that it was a state section and it was Mohammed bin Salman directly involved. And secondly, if this is established that Mohammed bin Salman personally gave the order or involved, would this have any qualitative impact on Russian-Saudi relations?
Questions based on hypothetical speculations, if and when established, and so on and so forth. I already answered this question today at the press conference after the negotiations with the Italian foreign minister. We take note that the Saudi investigation continues. We take note that they cooperate with the Turkish authorities, and we want this investigation, the results of this investigation, to be presented. To speculate what happens next is not my business, frankly. I told you that we are waiting for the results of Saudi investigation in cooperation with the Turkish authorities. If you have some other ideas, it's your right. We prefer to respect the principle of subsidiarity, which is applicable to any legal situation in the world.
Hi, Maha Yahya, Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. My question is very quick. Will Russia continue to support Bashar al-Assad if his continued presence in power is going to block reconstruction? And then as a quick follow-up, do you see eye to eye with Iran on this?
What was the second one?
Will Russia continue to support Bashar al-Assad if his presence in power will block reconstruction? And the follow-up was quickly, do you see eye to eye with Iran on this issue?
Well, I don't think there is any pair of two countries which see eye to eye on one or another issue, on anything for that matter. This is true for Russia, for Iran, for Turkey. We all have our presence in Syria. We have created a platform which we call Astana process, in spite of the fact that we don't have 100% the same positions, absolutely. But we united for the sake of the Syrian people not for the sake of playing any geopolitical games. We want Syria to be calm, to be stable. The borders of Syria we want to be secure so that nobody of its neighbors feels uncomfortable. On Bashar al-Assad, we repeatedly stated that we are not supporting any political figure in Syria. We respect Security Council resolution, we respect Geneva Communique of the June 2012, where it is clearly stated that the process must be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, and that only the people of Syria can decide the fate of their own country. And the method of such decision to be taken is embodied in the resolution itself: elections, constitution, and then elections. And it will be for the Syrian people to decide whether they want somebody to stay, whether they want somebody to go, whether they want somebody to come. As regards the link between Bashar Assad staying in power and the outside assistance, I just wanted to quote something which basically you pronounced. The State Department recently made an official statement that, and you know, of course, that the Americans repeatedly confirmed that the only purpose for them to stay in Libya is to eliminate the remnants of ISIL. So the State Department stated a couple of days ago the following: to defeat ISIL, it is necessary to stop Iranian influence in Syria, and there must be, to defeat ISIL, there must be radical changes in the Syrian regime and in the role of Iran. In other words, the United States justify their presence in Iran by the need to fight ISIL, and they say that it is impossible to defeat ISIL as long as Bashar Assad and Iran are there. It's a very weird logic, I would say, and I hope you don't share it. And I hope everybody is committed to the principle of the Syrian people themselves deciding the fate of their country through elections, observed by the United Nations, mind you.
You finished?
I try to be concise.
Mr. Lavrov, I have a very last question. When my wife, who happens to be Russian, has an argument with me, she often says, "Ty nie uważaешь меня," you don't respect me. It seems to me that this kind of perception can be translated to Russia as a whole, its self-consideration and the sense of its position in the world. The question, does Russia feel not respected enough on the world stage?
I wouldn't say so. I would say that maybe, you know, there is another Russian saying. You are afraid of me, then you respect me. Боишься, значит уважаешь. There is such a saying in Russia, but I'm not saying that we want to get respect through scaring everybody. Not at all. What we want is a mutually respectful dialogue. And this is the only basis on which we would talk to anyone. If our Western friends, the Americans, the British, who steer this Russophobic action, imposing Russophobic actions on quite a number of countries who don't want this but have to say yes to the solidarity, if they keep saying, okay, like Theresa May said recently, and they presented it to us as a huge shift in their position. She said, yes, we want to normalize relations with Russia. Yes, we want to have normal cooperation on many issues. We can do quite a number of useful things together. But Russia first must recognize that it was wrong. The same is being told to us by the United States. We will cooperate with you, but please admit your guilt and commit yourself to not repeating these bad things again. I hope if those who are interested in the Russian policies and domestic and international, you follow the dialogue which we have through microphones with the Americans, with the British, Salisbury, Amesbury, elections, meddling, and what have you. They say, we have actual facts that you did it. Okay, if you have facts, come to us. Put the facts on the table. Let's discuss them. Maybe, indeed, we have done something wrong for one or another reason. Said, no, we're not going to give you any facts. First, it is confidential information. And second, you know yourself that you did it. I'm not joking. This is what Rex Tillerson told me after I asked him to elaborate on his statement that they have undeniable facts that we meddled with elections. He laughed and said, but ask your special services, they know what I mean. By the way, recently my good friend Timo Soini, the foreign minister of Finland, said that we have undeniable facts that Russia tried to meddle with this GPS signal during the Trident Juncture training maneuvers. First, my question is why all this is being first announced to the media. If you have some concerns, normal, polite people raise direct question. Look, guy, I don't like what I heard. This is what I know. Can you explain this? I mean, if you have a problem or suspicion regarding your wife, I mean, you ask her directly, right?
Right away.
You don't go to the media and announce your concerns.
Right away. We thank very much Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov for this lively and very interesting performance, and we hope we will come back to the Med next year.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, you are kindly requested to remain seated. Please remain seated. Thank you so much.